So I'm within a project within the data science experience, and I can see my notebooks and my data assets. Today we're going to be coming over to the analytics asset area. I'm talking about a new item that's been added, flows. And under here, these are going to be visual model building, very similar to what you'd see with SPSS Modeler. So I'm going to click on my Canvas demo to open up a flow I already have created today. And so a couple of things here, right? So this is our visual model from data ingestion straight through to model building. And let's talk a little bit about this. So I'm going to do down here, there's a node for show or palette, which is really just show the different commands that we have available to us. And we might, one of the first things that kind of pops out to me is we might expect if we've used SPSS before that we would see like a data source or a sources area. And because it's inside the DSX framework, we're not going to see it under here. It's going to be like if we were inside of our notebook and we would come over here on our right hand side and it'll say find and add data sources. And if I click that, we can see both the files or if I had connections defined here for what data is available to us. And from there, I can just take a data source and drag it into my canvas. And then that's going to link me back. So exact same type of data or exact same data sources that we're working with for any of our projects inside the data science experience. So let's look at this, right? I'm going to do some of the things I would normally do to build a model in SPSS with this canvas. So the first thing I've got here is if I'm going to expand out some of my items here and talk about outputs and we've got our data audit node. So one of the first things I might do here is that I don't really know my data. I want to understand if there's variables I should include, exclude, or anything like that. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to click on execute, and this will go through and it's going to run a bunch of summary statistical information about all the variables in my data set. So once it's run, we'll notice over here in our right hand side there's a view outputs and versions. The dialog opened up and I can see here my data audit node. So I'm just going to click on this and we will get our information about our variables. So I can see all my variable names that were in here, what are their measurement levels. Here I get my kind of min-max standard deviations. Specifically, if I was to call out a couple variables, I can see towards my bottom here that my maintenance code, my days since last maintenance, those variables are not very high quality. Um, at all. And we can also kind of scroll down here and get a little bit of information about like, are any of my variables missing records or anything like that? Of course, my data set looks pretty good. It's also picking up that there may be a couple of outlier values. But outside of maybe these few variables, nothing too crazy. So let's come back in here. So I would always say then. So some of the first things that start to come to my mind would either be things like record operations. So you see the items we have here, or field operations. Specifically with my data set, so I brought in a filter node, and let's just open up what we've got inside of here. So we said when I looked at my data audit node that there were a few fields that I felt didn't have necessarily the quality to be included, i.e., they didn't have any variability in them, at least from what we saw in the data audit. So I've just pulled those variables in here and filtered those out of my data set. From there, we'd start coming into our types node, and it's probably easy enough just to talk right now about how you connect nodes. Obviously, you're not going to right click and you'll see there's no like connection. But if I take my mouse and I hover over, you'll see this little blue circle appears, and I can just drag this, and you'll see if I go towards others. That's just how you would go ahead and connect nodes to each other. So I've got the variables I probably want. So I'm going to open up my type nodes, and this is really where I want to set things like, for example, what are my variables that I want to go after. So for example, I have a asset ID, and if I click on my little buttons over here, you'll see that I've set its role equal to record ID. And all that means is that it's not going to be using this variable as a potential input. It's just not going to be included. As well as if I click on say like fail, you'll see that it's being set as my target. So if we get into our use type node settings, it's going to say okay great, so don't use record ID. Other variables might be available. And then this is the variable that would be the target of my model. And all the typical values you would expect in here, whether they're both, to exclude if they're a split or partition, whatever we might need to do, is available under this. So I've got kind of the variables set up the way I want. We also have charting capabilities in here. I would probably say if you look at this, right, it's only a couple of simple charts that exist today. Um, but I would expect to see a lot of expansion along this area. Um, just if we come in here, I can click on this and click execute. I think I'm just looking at humidity versus, I think it might have been ambient temperature, but we'll just open that up and we can get a look at that visualization. This might just be a nice way to help me kind of, visualize my data outside of, say, like the data audit. Data audit gave me a good high level view. Maybe I want to look at this to understand, do I want to transform this because maybe the distribution is not exactly looking the way I might want it to. I know from looking at the data that one of the things that immediately popped out to me is that my number of failures versus my number of successes or non-failures is not skewed very well at all, right? And that's good, right? We don't want things to fail often. But in my case, from a predictive point of view, I'm going to be most interested in trying to pick up and detect failures. So if we come through into here and we look at our record operations, I'm going to be using a balance node. The balance node just helps me make sure that there's a good representation between those two groups. I'll open that node up so we can take a look at what's going on inside of here. But essentially what we've got here is that I've said, okay, we're going to have our fail equals 0. Those are the records where people have not failed, and that they're going to count as a singular record, whereas right now the fail equals 1. Each one of those is going to get expanded to represent 13 records. So that's going to bring my data back into a kind of good proportion. I probably wouldn't use that for obviously future data, but it gives me a good way. I attached another node here just so I could kind of look at that distribution. So let's look at just one of the other chart types here. So I've got my fails, and we can see now, good, yeah, they're within a couple records of each other. I'm going to have about, what is it, about 230, 235 records in each one of my groups. So I know my distribution of records is really good. Uh, so let's go back into my palette over here. I'm going to go to my modeling area. So here we can see we've got a couple of different decision tree algorithms in here, as well as the random trees down here, linear and logistic regression, neural networks. And then, although I didn't need it for my data set, I might have wanted to run something like feature selection to understand if maybe there were some other variables that maybe I wouldn't want to include in my data set. But in my case, I dropped in a C5 node. It's just as simple as coming in here and click execute, and then that will create my golden nugget or my model results. If I right click on this, I'm going to click on view model because I want to, kind of get a good understanding of what's happened inside of here. So um, the information you're going to see on this screen is going to vary by the type of model that you run. So obviously I've got, things like decision rules and tree diagrams. But you're going to see different variables or different values than that, depending on what specific type of model that you ran. So I ran a C5. The target was the failed variable. There were 9 predictor fields possibly included. There was 467 records. It's created 35 different nodes in my tree with a total tree depth of 12 nodes deep at the deepest point. If we come through over to our predictor importance, we can see the variables that have been included, and we can also get an idea of exactly how important each variable was viewed. So humidity is playing a fairly good role, dryer position RPM, where something like the extension is playing a very insignificant or a much smaller role in the overall outcome. We can also see the top decision rules, so we can come down here and look and see, I won't walk through each one of these, but um, we can see how well, what that rule consists of, what variable combinations it has, as well as, how many records and stuff fall into it. And then lastly, we can come in and see our tree diagram. So we can hover over any one of these nodes to get an understanding of, like, say, right here, we can see that we're split about, 54-45. But if we start to come down much farther, we should start to see that start to vary a lot more. So right now, we go farther down that tree path, we can start to see that now we're getting into much more those non-failures are a lot higher in here, and I guess we could probably find one that's more the failures. But you can also go in and do things like display the labels. So maybe I don't want to, maybe I want to zoom in a little bit here. Uh, we can start to see the specific splits on here. So now we can see this branch here is, people who have less than 55.312 humidity. And then we can see each one. It's also nice that we can kind of, just sort of pan around, as well as sort of zoom in if we want to get sort of more granular detail on exactly how that goes. And this was very nice because I know one of the things that I'd always struggled with on the SPSS side is that when you built the tree, they could be very, very big. Um, And you could scroll around the screen, but somehow I find it a little bit easier to kind of just be able to, pull and drag this along. So lastly, I'm going to come back out here. Now that I've got my model nugget in here, I might want to do something like my analysis node to understand, kind of the, how well was my model doing in terms of making its predictions. But also one of the things that's always a big thing for me is that I like to break down whatever the analysis node does by the original target variable. So I've just come down here and set the breakdown to my original. Um, and the reason I do that, so if we just come back out, that's not where I wanted to right click. If I right click here and click on my execute and wait for a second for my results to pop back up. So here's my analysis node. I do that because, we can see that overall this is what we normally get right. It was 94.43% accurate, 5.57% wrong. But I'm often interested in seeing what it does within the subgroups. So I can see that it always, when it was a failure or when it was not a failure, it always predicted it was not a failure. And it was about 89% accurate when it was predicting whether the device would fail. Of interest, when before I did this, so when I didn't have I did this once without the balance node in there. It was the model was quote unquote, about 99% accurate, but it was 100% on failures and like, you know, a minuscule amount correct on the failing because there were so few records. Um, and so while the model looked good, it really wouldn't have fit like probably my business needs. So the balance node really helps out there. You can also drop on something like the table node. So again, I'll just execute this so we can kind of take a look at this. But this would be kind of giving me that way of just sort of, as a user being able to come in here and look at the data, the raw data, and how it's looking here, and then I can come over here and see, here was my fail column, here's my predicted value and the confidence it has in the prediction that it made. So that's good. And then lastly, the thing we do here is, and I didn't take it this far, but you probably want to get the data back out. So just like I pulled the data in from these files, so I went out to my data science experience object storage. I can also come in here and drop an object storage export so that I can drop that data back out. If I was thinking about some of the nodes that are inside of here, you would probably, I would say that a lot of the things that are common nodes that I would use all the time are in here. Um, if I was maybe to call out some things that, depending on what you're doing, I know people use all different types of nodes from the SPSS universe. What would be things that maybe um, that I thought were missing probably from what's in this today or what's in the current release. The first thing that I would say is if you go to the modeling tab here, we've got like 8 models. There's a lot more models in SPSS Modeler. Um, that doesn't mean that these won't be great. Maybe the specific ones that I thought about would be is there's a lot of like the auto modeling nodes like auto classification or auto numeric, which many times when I'm going through a quick exercise, the first thing I'll do is try one of the auto nodes to just test a bunch of models out for me, just to sort of see what techniques seem to apply well to the type of data. Obviously, those things aren't there yet. Um, you know, Maybe depending on your use cases, we've got like the Python and the R integration. Those nodes haven't been brought into here yet. Um, Outside of that, those would probably be some of like the bigger ones that I would probably call out as ones that were different. Or not kind of there yet. But very much since the very first time I've used it to the version that's currently available for testing, a lot farther along. Right? You couldn't build. This is not complicated, but it is a good representation of the types of different components you'd need to do to produce a model. And you probably would have been missing a little bit of this, the months back. Uh, so that's Canvas inside data science experience. I hope you enjoyed listening to this.